When my son called to tell me he'd gotten married, the second thing he said was to ask me to leave the cottage key under the welcome mat. Not the first thing. The first was hello. I stood in my kitchen, holding the phone against my ear, listening to him explain how they'd had a small ceremony in Collingwood 2 days prior. Just her immediate family, her maid of honor, his best man. Intimate, he called it. Private. They hadn't wanted any fuss. "We're hoping to use the cottage for the honeymoon, Dad," he said. "Just a week or so. If you could leave the key somewhere, we'd head up Friday." I looked out the window at the bird feeder I'd hung from the oak tree. A chickadee was working at the seeds. "Of course," I said. "Congratulations, son." I hung up and stood there a while. Then I sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where he'd done his homework for 12 years, and I stayed there until the light in the room changed. 3 days later, I drove to their condo building in Toronto and left a large envelope in their mailbox. I didn't ring the buzzer. I didn't knock. The note I'd tucked inside said only, "I thought your new wife should know about our family's history. Welcome to it. Dad." My daughter-in-law called me 3 hours later, and I could hear from her voice that she'd been crying for a long time. I'm 63 years old. I retired 4 years ago after 31 years as a chartered professional accountant, the last 12 as a partner at a mid-size firm in Barrie. My wife passed the same year I retired. Pancreatic cancer, 11 months from diagnosis to the end. We had known each other since we were 19. I don't talk about that much because I don't have the language for it yet, and I suspect I never will. What I do have is the cottage. It sits on the eastern shore of Georgian Bay, 40 minutes north of Barrie, and has been in my wife's family since her parents built it in 1974. We took it over when her mother passed in 2003 and spent 2 summers rebuilding the dock and repainting every room ourselves. My son grew up there every July and August, learning to swim in the cove, hauling himself up onto the raft in the afternoons, burning toast on the propane stove because neither of us was ever any good at breakfast. After my wife died, it was my son who kept me going. He called every Sunday without fail. He drove up from Toronto once a month to check in. He spent every Christmas with me. Sometimes just the 2 of us with a roast chicken and a bottle of red wine, which sounds quiet but wasn't. He has his mother's laugh. He fills a room the same way she did. So when he told me he'd met someone, I was genuinely glad. He brought her to Barrie for Thanksgiving the year before last. She arrived in a car I didn't recognize. New, expensive, the kind that announces its own price tag. And she stepped out carrying a bakery box of lemon tarts and complimenting my garden before she'd even reached the front step. She was striking, confident in the way that reads well in certain rooms. She shook my hand with both of hers, which I've noticed is something people do when they want to seem warm but haven't quite decided whether they like you. Over dinner, she asked thoughtful questions about my career, about the cottage, about how long it had been in the family. I answered everything generously, the way you do when your son is watching you and wanting you to be impressed by the person he loves. "Georgian Bay in the fall," she said, studying one of the photos I keep on the mantel. "That must be extraordinary. The leaves would be unreal." "It's something," I agreed. "What's the property valued at these days, roughly?" she asked. Not quite to me. She turned slightly toward my son as if it were a question for the room. "Waterfront along Georgian Bay has gone absolutely mad in the last few years." My son said he wasn't sure. She said the market there was unlike anywhere else in the country, that waterfront properties were the most secure thing a family could hold. That was the first time she mentioned the property's value. By dessert, she'd mentioned it twice more. I thought about it after they left. Then I decided I was the kind of man who worried too much about the wrong things, and I let it go. The changes came slowly enough that I almost didn't notice them accumulating. My son's Sunday calls shifted to every other week, then to whenever he got a chance. When we did speak, our conversations had a different quality, Briefer, more careful, like he was summarizing rather than talking. Gone were the long rambling calls about a difficult client or a project he was wrestling with or what he'd read that week. Now it was, "Everything's fine, busy at work," she says hi. She'd introduced him to her circle, colleagues from her design firm, couples she'd known since university. His old friends from engineering school appeared less and less on his social media. I noticed but said nothing. He was 34 years old. His friendships were his own to manage. At Christmas, he called to say they were going to spend the holiday with her family in Victoria. First time, in my memory, we hadn't spent it together. I said that was fine, that I understood, that it made sense to take turns. I cooked a roast for one and watched a film I'd been meaning to see for 2 years. In the spring, he called to tell me he'd proposed. She'd said yes. He sounded happy, genuinely, clearly happy, and I made my voice match his. "We're having a small celebration next weekend," he said. "Just her parents, her sister, a few close friends." I waited a moment. Should I plan to drive down? There was a pause I recognized as the kind that comes before something difficult. "It's really just her side of the family, Dad. Her mum has particular ideas about these things, and we're trying to respect that. We'll do something soon. Just the 3 of us." We never did. I heard about the engagement from my neighbor, who'd seen the post on Facebook and assumed I already knew. I thanked her and kept my face very still. Over the months that followed, I heard about the wedding planning in fragments. A venue in Collingwood, a photographer, a menu. Each detail arrived as an afterthought, offered the way you mention things to an acquaintance rather than someone who is part of your life. I was never consulted, never included. When I asked once, gently, whether there was anything I might contribute, my son said her family had everything organized and they didn't want to create confusion. That October, he called to ask my opinion on cufflinks, and I spent 20 minutes on the phone, with feeling something close to hope. It lasted until he mentioned, in passing, that the wedding date had already been set for the following March. He didn't tell me the exact date until the ceremony had already taken place. The morning I found out they'd gotten married, I was raking leaves in the backyard. My phone rang. It was my son's voice, and something about his tone told me, before he'd said the first word, that whatever was coming was not going to be easy. He explained the ceremony. A Thursday afternoon, a restored heritage hall near the Collingwood waterfront, her parents and her sister and their closest friends. A small thing, he said. Intentional. "We decided a big wedding wasn't really us," he said. "Too much pressure. We wanted something real." Something real, without his father present. "Congratulations," I said. My voice was very even. I've had a lot of practice being even. "Thanks, Dad. Look, we were wondering. We didn't have time to plan a proper trip, and we thought the cottage would be perfect for the honeymoon. A week, maybe 10 days. If you could leave the key under the mat, we'd head up Friday afternoon." There it was. Not, "Would you like to join us for dinner so we can celebrate together?" Not, "We're sorry you couldn't be there." The key under the mat. "I'll sort something out," I said. "Great, thanks, Dad, really." I stood in the yard for a long time after I hung up, the rake in my hand, the leaves going nowhere. That evening, I called an old colleague. A man I'd worked with for nearly 2 decades before he left the firm to start his own forensic accounting and investigation practice. We'd stayed close. He was the kind of person who'd seen everything that financial fraud could look like, and he had the patience of someone who believed getting it right mattered more than getting it fast. "I need your help," I said, and I told him everything I could. "How quickly?" he asked. "Before Friday." He met me at a coffee shop in Barrie 3 days later, a folder on the table between us. "She's not who she says she is," he said before I could ask. "Not entirely." The design firm, the one she'd mentioned at dinner as her thriving practice, the one she'd described to my son as the reason she worked such long hours was registered as a sole proprietorship with no employees, no commercial lease, and revenue filings that didn't match the lifestyle she'd been living. It wasn't technically fraudulent. It was a shell sustained by income from somewhere else. He pulled out a second document. She'd been briefly married before, 14 months, ending in divorce in British Columbia 4 years ago. The ex-husband's family had raised concerns about financial irregularities before it ended. Nothing had been pursued formally. It had simply stopped. "She found your son on purpose," my colleague said. He placed a printed email exchange on the table, obtained through sources he didn't explain and I didn't ask about. The messages were between her and someone whose name I didn't recognize, dated nearly 14 months before she and my son had their accidental meeting at an architecture conference in Toronto. They discussed properties along the Georgian Bay corridor, waterfront estates, inherited holdings. One message mentioned a specific road, the road my cottage sits on. I set the paper down and picked up my coffee. "There's more," he said. He walked me through the last piece carefully. Several years ago, a small real estate consortium had been pressuring elderly property owners along the Georgian Bay waterfront to sell, using misleading valuations and manufactured urgency. 3 families had sold at significant losses before a Barrie solicitor flagged the scheme to the RCMP. The investigation stalled and eventually went cold. One of the principals changed business names and moved on. My colleague pointed to a corporate filing. She'd been connected to a numbered company that held a consulting contract with that consortium. Not charged, not named publicly, but connected. And one of the properties that consortium had approached, unsuccessfully, because my wife had told their representative, quite directly, to get off her family's land, was the cottage. She had known about that cottage before she ever met my son. I didn't sleep much that night. I sat at the kitchen table and went through everything twice, 3 times, until I was sure I wasn't seeing what I wanted to see, rather than what was actually there. I thought about my son, the way he'd been as a boy, earnest, trusting, the kind of child who believed people meant what they said, the way his mother had worried, gently, that he was too open-hearted for a world that didn't always reciprocate. I wasn't going to confront him directly, not yet. He'd been told in some form that I was the problem, that my closeness to him was a weight on his marriage, rather than something worth protecting. He wouldn't believe me if I called and said, "The woman you married planned this." He'd defend her. He'd have to, because to believe me would mean dismantling something he'd built his last 2 years around. I needed him to see it himself. I spent the next morning carefully assembling what I had: the corporate filings, the marriage record from BC, the email exchange, a newspaper article about the real estate scheme, including a quote from one of the families who'd nearly lost their property, a letter my colleague had obtained from the ex-husband in BC, short, carefully worded, a quiet account of what he'd experienced. I added one more thing, a photograph. It was from the summer my wife and I rebuilt the cottage dock. We're both in it, covered in wood stains, squinting into the sun, laughing at something I can't remember now. I put it on top of the pile. Then I drove to their condo building in Toronto, walked to the mailbox panel in the lobby, and slid the envelope in. I made dinner. I read for a while. I went to bed at 10. My phone rang at 2:30 in the morning. It was my son. I could hear my daughter-in-law in the background, her voice high and unsteady, words I couldn't quite make out. "What did you put in that envelope?" he said. His tone was the one he used when he was trying not to shout, controlled, flat, a man holding something back. "Documents I thought were relevant," I said. "About our family, about hers." "Dad, she's saying this is harassment, that you're trying to destroy our marriage because you can't accept that I have my own life." "Read everything in that envelope," I said. "All of it. Don't just take her word for what's in there. She says it's all fabricated. that you hired someone to dig up lies. Has she explained why her name appears in a corporate filing connected to a real estate scheme that tried to pressure your mother into selling this cottage? Silence. Has she told you she was married before? More silence. Has she explained what her design firm actually earns and where the money she lives on actually comes from? Dad. Read the envelope, I said again, then call me. He called back 47 hours later. His voice was different, quieter, stripped of the defensive edge. He said he'd read everything, twice. He'd called the number my colleague had included for the man in BC. And they'd spoken for nearly an hour. He said almost exactly the same things happened to him, my son told me. The way he stopped talking to his family. The way he thought it was just love, that needing less from the people around him was what adults did. He didn't understand what had happened until it was already over. He paused. I found the emails on her laptop, the ones you included. I needed to see the originals myself. I understand. She knew about the cottage before she ever knew me. His voice cracked slightly on that sentence. She researched us. She researched Mum's family. Yes. She researched Mum's cottage. Yes. We were quiet together for a little while, the way you can be with someone when the thing that needs to be said has already been said. I don't know what to do, he said finally. You don't have to know right now, I told him. You just have to decide what you believe. My old colleague connected him with a family law solicitor in Toronto who specialized in marriage fraud cases. She was thorough and direct, and she told my son within the first meeting that the grounds for annulment were solid. The previous marriage, undisclosed. The misrepresentations about her business and financial standing. The documented evidence of premeditated targeting. The RCMP file on the Georgian Bay real estate scheme was reopened. New complaints had emerged from 2 other families along the corridor, and my son's solicitor submitted everything my colleague had compiled. My daughter-in-law retained a criminal lawyer within the week. The annulment was finalized 6 months later. I don't know, even now, what charges she ultimately faces or what comes of the RCMP investigation. My son's solicitor said it could take years, and I've learned over a long life that justice moves at its own pace and doesn't always arrive in the shape you imagined. What I do know is this. The morning after the annulment was confirmed, my son drove up to Barrie. He arrived just before noon, and we went to the diner on Dunlop Street that we used to go to when he was in university, and we sat across from each other in a booth by the window and ordered the same things we always used to order, and he talked for a long time. About the last 2 years, about the ways he'd slowly stopped recognizing himself, about the phone calls he hadn't made, and the visits he'd canceled, and the Christmas he'd spent 3 provinces away from home. I thought I was growing up, he said. I thought needing less from you was what adults did. Sometimes it is, I said. And sometimes it's just someone teaching you that your own family is the problem. I didn't say anything to that. I just flagged the server down and ordered us both another coffee. We opened the cottage that August, the first time in 3 summers I'd had company up there. He arrived on a Friday evening and we sat on the dock until midnight, watching the light go out over the bay. He'd brought a bottle of whiskey, the good kind, and we worked through most of it without any particular urgency. The dock needed some work. A couple of planks had softened over the winter, and we spent most of Saturday replacing them together. He was better with the tools than I remembered. At some point in the afternoon, I looked over at him crouched at the far end of the dock, driving screws with the same focused patience his mother used to bring to everything she built, and I felt something settle in my chest that had been loose for a long time. He comes up most months now, sometimes just for a weekend, sometimes longer if work allows. We've been talking about winterizing one of the back rooms so we can use the place into November, which would be something, The bay in November is a particular kind of cold and silver quiet that gets into you and stays. I think about that a lot lately, about how the things we almost lose teach us to hold the things we still have with a little more care. About the difference between a closed door and a lost one, and how long it can take to know which one you're standing in front of. The cottage is still in the family. The dock is solid. And my son calls every Sunday now, without fail, just like before. Some things, if you're patient enough and stubborn enough and willing to trust what you know, in your gut, even when the people you love are telling you you're wrong, some things do find their way back to you. Thanks for listening. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment and let me know what city you're watching from. I read everyone.